The knock came at 2:37 in the morning. I remember the exact time because I just turned to look at the alarm clock on my nightstand, the red digits burning through the dark like little warning lights. 3 slow knocks, then a voice through the door, flat, official, the kind of voice you only hear in movies until one day you don't. "Mr. Hayes, FBI, open the door." I sat up in bed and felt my chest go cold. Not afraid, exactly. Something older than afraid. The body knowing before the mind does. I'm 68 years old. I live alone in a clapboard farmhouse outside Brattleboro, Vermont, on a piece of land my wife Margaret picked out in the spring of 1987. She's been gone 4 years now, breast cancer, and I've kept the place exactly the way she left it. Same curtains, same little ceramic rooster on the kitchen window. I grow tomatoes and squash in the summer and I read in the winter, and most days I talk to nobody but the mailman. So when I came down the stairs in my robe and slippers and opened the front door, I don't know what I expected. A mistake, a wrong address. Some kid lost off Route 9. What I got was 6 federal agents in dark windbreakers and one of them holding up a badge in my porch light and saying, "Walter Hayes, we have a warrant for your arrest. Money laundering and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. $2.3 million. And behind them, standing on my own front walk in a black wool coat I bought him for Christmas 3 years ago, was my son, Ethan. 34 years old. CPA at a firm in Midtown Manhattan. My only child. He wouldn't look at me. He was staring at the porch boards and his wife Vanessa was standing a step behind him with her hand on his elbow. And she was the one who was crying. Or pretending to. I've watched that woman pretend things for 8 years and I know the difference between her real tears and the other kind. "Dad," Ethan said. "Quiet." To the porch boards. "I'm sorry, I had to." That's the part I keep coming back to. Not the cuffs, not the long drive in the back of the sedan with my hands behind me and my robe still on under a coat the agent let me grab from the hall closet. Not the booking room with its scratched plexiglass and its smell of old coffee. The part I keep coming back to is I had to. Because in that moment, standing in my own doorway in slippers, I understood something I would spend the next 11 months proving. My son had not been forced to do anything. My son had chosen this. And the woman behind him had chosen it with him. They drove me 81 miles to the Albany field office. Nobody spoke. The agent in the passenger seat kept glancing back at me in the mirror like he was checking I was still breathing. I was breathing fine. I was running numbers in my head, the way I used to run them 30 years ago, back when running numbers in your head was the difference between going home and not going home. See, here's the thing my son didn't know. Here's the thing nobody in my life knew except Margaret, and Margaret took it with her. Before I retired to Vermont and started growing tomatoes, I spent 26 years as a federal judge, Southern District of New York. I sat on the bench for some of the largest organized crime prosecutions of the late 90s and early 2000s. I sent men to prison whose names you would recognize if I said them out loud, which I won't. I was on a protective list for 9 years after I retired. The reason I bought a farm in Vermont under my wife's maiden name and stopped giving interviews and stopped going to the bar association dinners was because that's what you do when you've put away the kind of people I put away. My son knew I'd been a lawyer. He thought I'd done corporate litigation. That's what we told him, Margaret and I, when he was old enough to ask questions and not old enough to keep the answers to himself. By the time he was old enough for the truth, he wasn't interested. He was at Wharton. He was dating Vanessa. He had already started to look at his mother and me the way you look at furniture in a house you're planning to leave. So when they walked me into the field office at 4 a.m. and sat me in a small room with a steel table and a camera blinking in the corner, and when an agent named Reyes came in with a thick folder and started reading me my rights, I just folded my hands on the table and waited. 20 minutes, that's how long it took. The door opened and a man in his 50s walked in. Gray suit, no tie. He had the kind of face you stop noticing after 30 seconds and remember perfectly 30 years later. He looked at the agent, and the agent stood up and walked out without a word. Then he looked at me, and his expression did something I will remember for the rest of my life. It softened, and then it tightened, and then it went still. "Your Honor," he said. I didn't say anything. "It's been a long time. David, you remember me. You testified in front of me in 2003. The Marchetti case. You were ATF then. I'm SAC of the Albany office now. Congratulations." He sat down across from me. He didn't open the folder. He just looked at it on the table between us. And then he looked at me, and he said very quietly, "Sir, would you like to tell me what the hell is going on here?" And that was the moment I understood that whatever my son and his wife had built around me, it was big enough and ugly enough that even the federal government couldn't see the shape of it yet. I asked David for three things: a glass of water, a phone call to an old friend in D.C. who would remember me, and 48 hours of his patience. He gave me all three. By 6 that morning, I was no longer under arrest. By noon, the U.S. Attorney's Office in Albany had quietly opened a parallel investigation, and David Reyes had sworn his lead forensic accountant to silence. By the end of that week, I was sitting in a borrowed office in a federal building in Albany, 3 states away from my farmhouse, looking at bank records and shell company filings and notarized documents that bore my signature on them. My signature. Except I had not signed any of them. The first one I looked at was a deed of trust, transferring my house in Vermont, the house Margaret picked out, the house I have lived in for 39 years, into the name of a Delaware LLC called Greenmount Holdings, dated 18 months earlier. Notarized in White Plains, New York, by a notary named Linda Park. I had never been in White Plains in my life. I had never met Linda Park. The signature on the document was a competent forgery. Not good. Competent. The W in Walter had a little loop at the top that I haven't made since I was 19 years old. The second was a power of attorney, also forged, giving my son Ethan signing authority over a brokerage account in my name that I did not know existed. The account had been opened with a wire transfer of $40,000 from a bank in Panama. The Panama bank traced back to a shell company in Belize. The shell company in Belize traced back to a numbered account in the Cayman Islands. The Cayman account, when the forensic accountant finally cracked it open 3 weeks later, was funded by wire transfers from a network of dental practices in New Jersey. Dental practices. 16 of them. I want you to understand what I felt, sitting in that office with a paper cup of vending machine coffee in my hand, looking at 16 dental practices in New Jersey. I felt the floor drop. Because I knew what dental practices in New Jersey are. I knew what they had been in 1998 and 2001 and 2004 when I was sentencing the men who owned them. They are the laundry. They have always been the laundry. Cash businesses, lots of small transactions, hard to audit. The DeLuca family ran 22 of them out of Bergen County in the 90s, before I sent Salvatore DeLuca to a federal pen in Pennsylvania for 23 years. Salvatore DeLuca got out in 2019. Salvatore DeLuca had a nephew named Marco who, according to the forensic accountant, owned a real estate firm in Manhattan that had hired my daughter-in-law Vanessa 3 years before she met my son. I sat in that office and I did not cry and I did not throw anything and I did not call my son. I asked David Reyes for a second cup of coffee, and when he brought it, I said, "I want to see everything, every document, every wire, every email. I want to know what they were going to do with me." He looked at me for a long time. He said, "Your Honor, I have to ask. Did you know any of this?" "No." "Did you suspect any of this?" "No." "Then I have to ask you one more thing, and I need you to think about it before you answer. Are you sure your son didn't know who his father was?" And I sat with that question for a long time, because here's what I had to admit to myself in that little borrowed office in Albany. Margaret had wanted to tell him. Margaret had said, more than once, that a boy ought to know what his father had done. I had said no. I had said it would be a burden. I had said the work was over and the danger was over, and there was no reason to put it on him, but Margaret was a lawyer too before she was sick, and Margaret knew things she didn't tell me. And in the last year of her life, when she was on the morphine and didn't always know who she was talking to, she said something to me one afternoon that I had put away in a drawer in my head and not opened until that moment in Albany. She said, "Walt, I think Vanessa knows." I had said, "Knows what, honey?" And she had said, "About you, about what you did. I think she's known the whole time." And I had kissed her forehead and told her to rest. I sat in that office in Albany and I opened that drawer and I looked at what was inside it. My daughter-in-law had married my son 8 years ago. She had met him at a charity auction in Manhattan, the kind of thing my son got invited to because he worked at the right firm and lived in the right zip code. She had been 31 then, beautiful in a polished way, smart, attentive, a real estate agent with a portfolio of clients in the city. Margaret had not liked her. Margaret had said she watched our son the way a person watches a deer they are about to shoot. I had told Margaret she was being unfair. I sat in that office and I added up the years. Marco DeLuca's real estate firm had hired Vanessa in 2014. Vanessa had met my son in 2017. They had married in 2018. By 2020, they were asking me to add Ethan as a signatory to my checking account for emergencies. I had said no. By 2022, they were asking me to put Ethan on the deed to the farm for estate planning. I had said no. By 2023, they had stopped asking. By 2024, they had simply taken what they wanted, using a notary in White Plains and a competent forgery of my signature with the wrong loop on the W. And then they had built a money laundering operation, $2.3 million of dirty money from the nephew of a man I had sent to federal prison. And they had run all of it through accounts in my name. The plan, when I finally understood it, was beautifully simple. I was the firewall. If anyone caught the operation, the trail led to a 68-year-old widower in Vermont with a perfectly competent legal background and no provable connection to organized crime. I would be arrested. I would be charged. I would die in a federal facility somewhere in upstate New York, probably before my trial, and the operation would continue under a new firewall. The only reason it didn't work was that David Reyes had testified in front of me in 2003 and remembered my face. The forensic team spent 4 months pulling the whole thing apart. I was kept in a safe house in Saratoga Springs for most of it, on the recommendation of the U.S. Marshals, because Salvatore DeLuca was alive and out of prison, and the assessment was that he might prefer his nephew's firewall not be available to testify. I read books. I called my sister in Phoenix on a burner phone twice a week. I did not call my son. What I did instead was record him. The agents asked me to. They were building a case, and the case needed Ethan and Vanessa to admit on tape what they had done. So in the 4th month after the wire had been approved and the script had been worked out, I called my son. I told him I had been confused for a while after the night with the agents. I told him the charges had been dropped and that I didn't fully understand what had happened. I told him I was scared and I wanted to come down to the city and see him and talk things through, father to son. He cried on the phone. I want you to know that. My son cried on the phone and said, "Dad, I've been so worried about you. Come down. Stay with us. We'll figure everything out." I drove down to Manhattan on a Tuesday in November with a federal recording device in the lining of my coat. I went to my son and daughter-in-law's apartment on the Upper East Side. Vanessa hugged me at the door and I felt her hand pause for 1 second on my back. Checking. And I knew right then that she knew. She did not find what she was looking for, because the device was sewn into the seam and not into the lining the way she would have expected. I had testified in front of enough women like her to know what they check. I sat at their dining room table and I drank a glass of wine and I let them talk. I let them talk for 2.5 hours. I let Vanessa get into her second glass and her third. I asked questions that any confused old man would ask, and they answered them, because they thought I was a confused old man. And this is the part that took me the longest to accept, they had been telling themselves a story for 8 years in which I was a confused old man. And the story was so comfortable they could not stop telling it even when the man in front of them was running a wire. Vanessa said at one point, with my son sitting right next to her, "Walter, you have to understand, the house was just sitting there. You weren't using it. You weren't going to live forever. We were planning ahead." My son said, "It was supposed to be a tax thing." Vanessa explained it to me, "It was supposed to be a tax thing, Dad." And Vanessa said, "Don't be like that, Ethan. Your father isn't stupid. He knows how the world works. He was a lawyer." And there was a pause. A very small pause. And then she said, "We know what you were, Walter." I set my wine glass down. What I was. Margaret told me. At the end. I looked at her. I looked at her son. My son was looking at his hands. I said, "What did Margaret tell you?" Vanessa smiled at me. She had a beautiful smile. I have to give her that. She said, "She told me what you did before you retired. She told me you put a lot of people away. She told me you put a lot of people away. She thought I should know in case it ever became relevant." And it became relevant, Walter. It became very relevant. I sat at that dining room table and I felt something I have not felt in many years. I felt the old courtroom calm. That thing that comes down on you when you understand exactly what the witness is doing and exactly how the case is going to land. I felt my pulse slow. I felt the room get clear. I said, "Margaret told you in confidence. Margaret was on a lot of medication, Walter. And you went to Marco DeLuca." She did not move. She did not blink. She just sat there with her wine glass in her hand, and after a moment she said, "I don't know what you're talking about." But my son did. My son's head came up slow, like he was waking from a long sleep, and he looked at his wife with an expression I have never seen on his face before, and I hope to God I never see again. Because that was the moment my son understood what his wife had used him for. That was the moment he understood that the woman he had married had picked him out of a charity auction the way you pick a tool out of a drawer. Vanessa, he said, who is Marco DeLuca? She didn't answer. Vanessa, who is Marco DeLuca? She didn't answer. Vanessa, who is Marco? I stood up from the table. I said, son, I want you to know something. I want you to listen to me. I love you. I have always loved you. Your mother loved you. And I am sorry that we did not tell you who I was. Because if we had, I think this would have gone differently. I think you would have known what kind of woman you were marrying. He started to cry. Real crying this time. Not the porch crying, I said. I am going to leave now. There are federal agents in the hallway. They have been listening to everything that has been said at this table for the last 2.5 hours. They are going to come in, and they are going to arrest both of you. And I want you to cooperate, Ethan. I want you to tell them everything. Because the only thing that is going to keep you out of a federal penitentiary for the next 20 years is the truth. And the truth is that this was her, and you let her. He looked up at me. His face was wet. He said, Dad, please. I said, I'll be at the courthouse. Every day. I promise you that. And I walked out. The agents came in 40 seconds after the apartment door closed behind me. I waited in the hallway. I heard Vanessa scream. Once. The way a person screams when they finally understand the game is over. I heard my son say nothing. The trial took 14 months. Vanessa hired the best defense attorney she could find and tried to blame the entire scheme on my son. My son, on the advice of a lawyer I quietly paid for, told the truth from the witness stand for 3 days straight. He laid out every document, every wire, every conversation, every time Vanessa had asked him to forge my signature, and every time he had said yes because he was afraid of her and because he had let himself believe her stories. He admitted he had known about the money laundering for at least the last 14 months of the operation. He admitted he had stood on my porch at 3 in the morning and helped have me arrested for crimes he had committed. Vanessa got 26 years in federal prison without the possibility of early release. Marco DeLuca was indicted on a superseding count and is currently awaiting trial. Salvatore DeLuca, who was 79 years old and in poor health, was named as an unindicted co-conspirator. My son got 11 years. The judge took the cooperation into account. I sat in the front row of the gallery for every day of the trial, the way I had promised. And on the day of sentencing, I watched my son turn around in his orange jumpsuit and look at me. And I nodded at him once, because I did not trust myself to do anything else. I drove home to Vermont that night. 8 hours in the dark. I went into the kitchen, and I stood at the window with the little ceramic rooster on the sill. The one Margaret bought at a flea market in Bennington in 1991. And I looked out at the dark yard where the tomatoes used to be. I thought about what Vanessa had said at the dining room table. We know what you were. I thought about the years I had spent on the bench, the men I had sentenced, the ways those sentences had reached forward through 20 years and into my own house, my own kitchen, my own son. I thought about how Margaret, in her last months, had told my daughter-in-law a secret because she wanted to give her one last chance to understand the kind of family she had married into. I thought about how that secret had been a gift and how Vanessa had taken the gift and sharpened it into a knife. I went into the den. I sat at Margaret's old desk. I took out a sheet of paper. I wrote my son a letter. The first of 4 I would write him over the next year. I told him I loved him. I told him I forgave him for the porch and for the cuffs and for the 3 in the morning. I told him there was something I would never forgive, and that was not the betrayal. It was the silence. The 8 years of silence when he had watched his wife circle me and had said nothing. Because he had stopped seeing me as a father a long time before the federal agents ever knocked on my door. I told him I would visit. I told him I would write. I told him the farm would be here when he got out if he wanted it. And I told him the thing I had needed to tell him for 34 years and had been a coward about. I told him who I had been before I was his father. I told him about the bench and the men and the years on the protective list. I told him that I had thought I was protecting him from a burden, and instead I had left him defenseless in front of a woman who had done her homework. I sealed the letter. I put it on the corner of the desk where Margaret used to keep her reading glasses. Then I sat in her chair, in the dark, in the house she picked out in 1987, and I let myself, finally after 11 months, cry. Not for the arrest, not for the trial, not even for my son, for the trial. not even for my son. For the version of him I had built in my head over 34 years. The boy I thought I had, the man I thought he was becoming. The Sunday phone calls and the grandchildren we were supposed to have and the Christmas mornings that were never going to happen now. Not the way I had pictured them. I cried for that boy. The one who never quite existed. And then I washed my face, and I went upstairs. And I went to bed in the house I still own, under my own name, with the deed restored and the locks changed, and a federal commendation in a frame on the wall of the den that I will probably never hang. I am 68 years old. My son is in a federal prison in Otisville. I visit him on the second Saturday of every month. We don't talk much. Mostly we sit. Sometimes he asks about the garden. Sometimes I ask about the books he's reading. People ask me how I can do it. How I can sit across a table from the man who let his wife put me in handcuffs in my own doorway. And I tell them the truth, which is the only thing I have left that's worth anything. You can forgive your child. You should forgive your child. A father who can't forgive his child has nothing left to be a father with. But you don't forget. You never forget. And if there is one thing I would tell every parent listening to this story, it is this. Tell your children who you are. All of it. The hard parts and the dangerous parts and the parts you think are over. Tell them while you can. Tell them before someone else does. Because the people who want to hurt you will find out who you are eventually. And if your own children don't know first, you have left them standing in the wrong place when the truth finally walks through the door. I've had a lot of time to sit with this story since the night the agents came up my porch steps. 4 years of quiet mornings at the kitchen window, watching the same light come up over the same field Margaret picked out in '87. And the thing I keep coming back to over and over is that none of what happened to me was random. Every piece of it was planted somewhere. By somebody. A long time before the knock at the door. Vanessa didn't appear out of nowhere. She was hired by a man whose uncle I had sent to federal prison in 1998. That was a seed planted 20 years before she ever shook my son's hand at a charity auction. My silence about who I had been. That was a seed too, planted every time I told Margaret no. Every time I decided my son couldn't handle the truth about his own father. And my son's slow drift away from us. The years he stopped calling. The holidays he started skipping. Those were seeds. Quiet ones. The kind you don't notice until something with teeth grows out of them. That's the part I want any father, any mother, any grandparent listening to me to understand. The cause is almost always older than the effect. By the time the consequence shows up at 3 a.m. in a federal windbreaker, the cause has been working in the dark for years. So what do you do with that? You can't go back and unplant what you've already put in the ground. I can't. I sat at Margaret's desk the night of the sentencing, and I had to make peace with that. What I could do, what I'm still doing, is choose what I plan from this day forward. I think about it in terms of 3 things now. 3 things I wish I had given my son in equal measure and only gave him one of. The first is character, not the polite kind. The kind that holds when nobody is watching, when the wife you love is whispering in your ear that it's just paperwork, just a tax thing, just a signature. My son had no foundation for that whisper to break against. I never built him one. I thought providing for him was the same as forming him. It isn't. The second is judgment. The hard, slow, expensive habit of looking at a thing twice before you sign your name to it. I had it. I never taught it. I assumed my son would absorb it from the air in our house. He didn't. The air in our house was love without instruction, and love without instruction is a beautiful kind of dangerous. And the third is grit. The willingness to lose something you want rather than take something that isn't yours. My son lost that one early and I didn't see it, because losing it doesn't make a sound when it happens. If you're listening to me and you still have time, and most of you do, more than you think, go plant those 3 things in the people you love. Tell them the hard stories. Tell them who you really are. Don't leave them defenseless in front of the next person who decides to study them. That's the only revenge worth anything in the end. Not the courtroom. Not the verdict. Just the next generation standing in the right place when the truth walks in.